3 Roman legions marched into Germania. The army never came back. Their commander died in the mud. Their eagles, the standards of legion, would rather be wiped out than surrender, vanished into the trees, and stayed missing for 30 years. And the man who led them there had grown up in Rome, Roman citizenship, equestrian rank, one step below the senatorial class. He had commanded Roman cavalry in Roman wars under Roman eagles. His name was Arminius. Rome wasn't ambushed by an enemy it failed to see. Rome was ambushed by a man it had raised. Arminius was a German noble, handed over to Rome as a boy, a pledge of his tribe's loyalty, which is the polite word for a hostage. He grew up inside the machine. He learned Latin. He learned how a legion breaks camp at dawn, how a column stretches thin on a bad road, how long a cohort takes to form a line when the order comes late. He led auxiliary cavalry for Rome and led it well. Rome had every reason to think it had made him one of its own. That wasn't carelessness, it was investment. Rome spent years turning this man into an insider and never once considered that an insider is simply someone who knows where the weak points are. Because he had also seen what came after conquest: the tax assessments, the magistrates. Roman law handed down to people who already had their own. So he made a choice that cost him everything he'd earned. He picked the losing side, his own. The man he had to fool was Publius Quinctilius Varus, a competent governor with 3 legions and a job, turned conquered ground into a paying province. Then the warning came. A German chief named Segestes told Varus plainly that a conspiracy was forming. "Arrest them all," he said. "Arrest me too, if that looks fairer. Just arrest Arminius." Varus refused, and inside his tent, the refusal made sense. Segestes hated Arminius over a stolen daughter. It looked like a family feud with a Roman army attached. So Varus weighed a rival's accusation against an officer who had ridden beside him for months, spoke his language, and had never given him a reason to doubt. He kept marching.
We are mirroring.
First door closed. Then came reports of a rebellion, distant, minor. The kind of trouble a governor settles on his way to winter quarters. Varus turned the column toward it, and he traveled heavy because he wasn't expecting a battle. Wagons, pack animals, servants, merchants, wives, children. This was a police action. Arminius rode with him, then asked leave to ride ahead and bring up his own men. Varus let him go. He came back, not with reinforcements, with the men who had been waiting. 2,000 years later, archaeologists digging that ground found a mule's bell packed tight with straw so it couldn't ring. Somebody had silenced it before the Romans arrived. On paper, a legion is a solid block of shields that moves like one animal. A block doesn't fit down a forest track, so it stretches cohort behind cohort, wagon behind wagon, strung out over miles, until the front has no idea what's happening at the rear. Then give it weather. The rain came in hard and didn't stop. The track turned to a pace that pulled at every boot and swallowed wheels to the axle. A legionary shield was oak faced with hide, soaked. It doubled in weight and hung off his arm like something dead. Overhead, wind took the treetops, and the forest made a sound like surf loud enough that a shouted order died 40 feet from the man who gave it. Then the first spear came out of the green. A man went down. The ranks turned. Nothing there, wet trunks, moving branches, rain, then another. Then a dozen. The Germans weren't fighting a battle. They were throwing from cover at a target 3 miles long that couldn't turn to face them, then stepping back into the trees. Every Roman there had trained his whole life to find the enemy line and break it. There was no line. There was a forest that killed a few men every 100 yards and gave them nothing to kill back. It ran 3 days, maybe 4. Pneumonius Valla commanded the cavalry second in the entire army. On the last day, he took the horsemen and rode and left the infantry standing where they were. The Germans ran him down. Not one of them reached the Rhine. And somewhere in those hours came the thought that must have been worse than the spears. There was no rebellion. It had been shaped for exactly this place, this weather, this stretched out column, by a man who knew precisely how a Roman army moves on a wet road in autumn. Because Rome had taught him. Varus was wounded, his army in pieces, the Rhine days away and every mile of it held. He understood what came next, not death. Capture. A Roman governor paraded through Germania. He drew his sword and killed himself. 15 to 20,000 men. Rome wouldn't lose that many in a single battle again for 200 years. The 17th, the 18th, the 19th. Rome never used those numbers again, not once, in 400 remaining years of empire. Augustus was the most controlled political operator in the ancient world. For months, he did not cut his hair or trim his beard. He beat his head against a door. And Suetonius says he would cry out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." 6 years passed before Rome could stand on that ground again. When the soldiers finally reached it, the bones were still lying where the men had fallen scattered, where they'd been cut down running, heaped where they'd stood and been surrounded. Broken weapons. Horse bones. Human skulls. Still fastened to the tree trunks. They buried all of them as kin. Because no man could tell a stranger's bones from his brother's. Arminius won his war and lost his peace. 12 years later, his own family murdered him. But the border never moved again. It wasn't the forest. Armies marched through forests. It wasn't the weather, or the warriors in the trees. Rome fought them for 4 more centuries and usually won. It was a chain of ordinary decisions, every one defensible on the day it was made. A warning dismissed because the man giving it had a motive to lie. A detour taken because governors settle small troubles. Baggage brought along because nobody expected a battle. An officer allowed to ride ahead because he'd ridden ahead 100 times before. Together, they killed an army. Because the weapon at Teutoburg was never the spear, it was trust placed exactly where Rome had spent 20 years teaching itself to place it. Rome didn't lose 3 legions when the first spear came out of the trees. It lost them years earlier when it took a boy from a German tribe, taught him Latin, gave him citizenship, put him in command of Roman cavalry, and never once considered it had just built the perfect enemy.